All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of the Bible, its origins, its holiness, how everything comes together to give us exactly what we came for.
Today, we're going to take a tour of the Museum of the Bible, and they're going to talk to us about how they know what it is, why it is, and the authenticity and the work that they put into it, and a little bit about some of the manuscripts. This is a relatively new set of videos compared with last week's. But the Museum of the Bible isn't just about, it's not a museum dedicated to the Bible in the sense of, oh, here's an old Bible, here's an old Bible, here's an old Bible. Their primary work is figuring out how all of it is interconnected. And when you take all of the different scriptures, the manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we're going to have an in-depth video on, how we look at them and how we work to determine how they all overlap and why it's so important that when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, we discovered that after all these years, what we had not changed when suddenly we had something that was almost 500 to 1,000 years older. So what is the Bible? It's the sacred scriptures of Christians comprising the Old Testament, the New Testament, and for the Catholic Church, by the way, the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonic books. It is also the sacred scriptures of some other religion, such as Judaism. Middle English, from the Old French, from medieval Latin, biblia, from Greek, plural of biblion, book, diminutive of biblos, of papyrus, ancient Phoenician city from which the papyrus was exported. For us, this is more than just a book. It is something that we believe is God-breathed. It is something that we believe that is inspired and inerrant. And the reason that that is so important is because we are basing our life on the promises that God gives to us through the book. We are not saved through the Bible in the sense that the Bible saves us. We are saved because the Bible is the Word of God. We're saved by Jesus alone. But He uses the scriptures and what it says to talk to us, to walk with us, to answer our questions, to guide us, and to direct us. And so therefore, since I can't just say, hey, God, answer my question like I could Google or Siri or one of the others, we have to have a particular set of something to guide and direct us. And that's what the scriptures are. The academic research wing of the Museum of the Bible, as the Scholar Initiative, fosters biblical research at colleges, universities, and seminaries across the world, planning and supporting academic projects related to the languages and material culture of the Bible, and capitalizing on artifacts in the museum collections. Past projects have included the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Greek papyri with secular and religious texts, ancient translations of the Hebrew Bible, the Greek text of the Pauline epistles, and various Aramaic, Coptic, Ethiopic, and Hebrew and Latin manuscripts. I want you to think about the fact of how much language has changed since you were in school. Even if you're only in junior high school and high school, the scriptures don't change. But sometimes we look at a word in the scriptures and it doesn't mean what our particular culture and time translates it as. This is why everybody's always trying to paraphrase or update the Bible. Because when we look at the old King James, it uses certain words that are so old, they've lost their meaning to us because we've changed the meaning. It's also important, by the way, that when we read secular scriptures, books from that period, we see what the culture was saying at that time and compare it to what the scriptural writers were saying at the same time. We're looking for how words are used. We're looking for certain stories, certain ways that individuals use to teach. Every one of us has gone through multiple different ways that we have been taught because they're constant. When I was in school, by the way, we had new math. That got changed to newer math and then new math. And in other words, we're always looking. There's phonics. There's all these different ways that we use to teach children in schools and even ourselves the various processes by which we both understand, by the way we also communicate. We have to have a basic understanding of these things to know exactly what's happening. So here's the opening for the Museum of the Bible.
We're collaborating with the Museum of the Bible to apply a technology called multispectral imaging to Codex Climaci Rescriptus. Codex Climaci Rescriptus is one of the sort of premier items in the collection of the Museum of the Bible. It is a manuscript that originally comes from the Sinai Desert, from St. Catherine's Monastery of the Sinai, which is a monastery that holds the world's oldest continually operating library. If you were to hold a page of the manuscript in your hands, you can see that there's an erased layer of text, but it's very faint, and generally it's not visible enough for you to be able to read it on its own. So with multispectral imaging, we look at the manuscript in different wavelengths of light, and we take images in different wavelengths throughout that spectrum of light, visible and invisible, and then we use those different images and apply algorithms to the entire set of those images to produce derivative images in which we try to make this erased layer of text as visible as possible. And you could call this textual forensics. We are applying forensic techniques to an ancient manuscript to try to render legible layers of text that are no longer legible and sort of reverse the erasure that occurred to this manuscript in the Middle Ages. So this is sort of virgin territory for brand new discoveries of texts from the ancient world that affect Christian and Jewish history, as well as our understanding of classical science.
When I was in high school, you had a typewriter. When I got to college, they had created the Smith Corona with a correcting cartridge, which meant that if I made a mistake, rather than having to start all over again, I could take out the ink cartridge, put in the correcting, and I could back it up, and it would type the exact same letter in white, and then I would start over again. It was a modern, amazing adventure. Occasionally, my professor would say, Mitch, I noticed that you had something else originally in this place, and then you typed over it. See, today with computers, we make a correction, we simply print out a new copy. Wasn't that way 40 years ago. Back with some of these manuscripts, they discovered that there were things that were written, then carefully erased, and then rewritten. Conspiracy theorists immediately started to say, aha, see, the reason, because it actually said Jesus didn't rise from the dead, or Jesus wasn't God. In other words, they said, and then later at the, like 325 AD, Council of Nicaea, that's when they changed it and said this, this, and this. So you're just trying to cover it up. Or somebody even in modern times erased this very carefully and then redid it so that it teaches what you teach. So the Museum of the Bible is using these different things to go and to try to find out what it was that was originally written underneath. Was it that they just misspelled a word? Did he copy 2 lines down and had to go back? Because remember, back in those days, either the papyrus or the vellum was very expensive. The ink was very expensive. You didn't want to waste it. And so you had to be very, very careful. And you literally did 1 letter at a time, very carefully copying it. So they use this to make sure that they can show people, no, there is no conspiracy here. Here's what it says underneath. Just because we accept scriptures by faith doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to understand more about them, who wrote them, when they were written, and what was going on. Letters from college. It's an interesting thing when Nancy and I are beginning to clean everything, getting ready for retirement. And Nancy found all of these letters that we wrote to each other during college. Nancy went straight through college. I kept running out of money, having to go back to work for a semester, then come back to college. And so during that time, we were apart. And so we wrote back and forth. And it gave her mail in her box at Seward, and it gave me something to do. And we would write all these letters about how much we loved each other and what was going on in our lives. And it's interesting because now, all these years later, we go back and we look at these letters. Sometimes we remember exactly what was happening. Other times we don't. Sometimes we look at it and we say, well, that was a silly thing to say. But it gives us a glimpse into something that happened over 40 years ago. And now all of a sudden, this is what we're looking for in the scriptures as well. In the year that King Uzziah died, most of us don't even know who King Uzziah is. But when he starts off that way, why would you say that? Well, because in the year that President Kennedy was assassinated, in the year the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, in the year that 9/11 took place. These are things that for those of us who are alive at that point, we can immediately go back and we remember that day very clearly if we were old enough. I only remember one thing about John F. Kennedy's assassination. I remember my mom watching our tiny little black and white TV and crying uncontrollably. That's all I remember. But it was enough to imprint itself. Some of my memories I have because we have old movies of them. But in this case, I remember it because it was shattering. We were asking my mom what was wrong. I was only 3 years old, but I knew something terrible had happened. I just didn't understand the wholeness of it. But when you put these kind of things in place, the culture, the time, the events that were happening, it gives you a better understanding. It does not change what is written. It gives us a better way of understanding it. Have you ever shared a story over and over again, and then one day wondered if you were telling it correctly? Because all of a sudden, something that happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, or something that someone told you, and all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, did that really happen that way? We find ourselves sometimes questioning it. We all remember things, but that does not mean we understand the full context because we always see things from different angles. And so I'm standing on a corner, you're standing on the opposite corner, something happens between us. We both get together, we both tell our stories, and even though we were both watching it, our stories are somewhat different. We have a different perspective, and it helps when we have someone or something that provides a historical narrative. Because all of a sudden we realize, you were standing there, I was standing here. However, it was someone you knew that was involved in whatever took place. There was an emotional something going on. And so as you're telling your story, there's something more than just a presentation of facts. Someone standing on that corner simply says, oh, it was at this time. Sometimes we know exactly what time it is. Other times we go, it was about 1 o'clock. And then we realize it was closer to 2:30. But we're always looking for these things because it helps us put into context what we're seeing, what was written, why it was written a certain way, and why certain references that we may not understand are actually that which brings us a deeper meaning of what we're seeing. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were a collection of ancient Jewish texts discovered in caves near the Dead Sea between 1947 and 1956, containing the oldest known biblical manuscripts and other religious writings, and by the way, some secular writings from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century, okay? We've got this amazing 300 years of things that were written down, and they're going to tell you all about it. But all these things were written down, rolled carefully up, and put it into a vase and in a place where the temperature and actually the climate was perfect to preserve them. Composed primarily in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, these scrolls offer crucial insights into the history of Judaism and the Hebrew Bible, with most containing copies of the Old Testament books except Esther. Some scrolls were produced by the Qumran community, likely the Essenes, while others may have come from Jerusalem or other groups. And one of the things, by the way, I need to point out is a lot of historians and theologians think that John the Baptizer, because his parents were so old, they think that he was actually raised by the Essenes. One of the things that the Essenes, by the way, were best known for is out in the middle of the desert, every day they walked through a giant pond of water in a form of baptism. Because baptism, by the way, may not take place exactly the way we do it in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, there were always the purification rites. And so they looked at it and they said, why was baptism so important to John? Because it was something that his community practiced with great reverence. And so when we find this out, the Essenes, by the way, were also a very conservative group, which means that when they wrote things down and they chronicled things, they did it very carefully. So now we're going to go on a little bit of a tour of the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Museum of the Bible.
In early 1947, less than 30 miles east of Jerusalem, A young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Adib was trying to retrieve a goat that had wandered away from his flock. Up in the craggy limestone hills on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, near Qumran, he began throwing rocks into caves to determine which one the animal might have wandered into. From the mouth of what is now known as Qumran Cave 1, Muhammad heard what sounded like breaking pottery. Too frightened to enter alone, he returned the next day with companions to investigate. When they entered the cave, they saw tall, cylindrical clay pots, which contained rolls wrapped in linen. Today, these and other artifacts found in the area are known as the Dead Sea Scrolls.
We'll examine the Dead Sea Scrolls by looking at 4 related topics, starting with the scrolls themselves. What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? And how did they survive for almost 2,000 years before being discovered? The shepherds who first discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls had no idea of their value. They took them to a leather worker and antiquities dealer called Kondo, who bought them for a small sum. When he noticed lettering on the scrolls, he sold them to Archbishop Samuel of the Syrian Orthodox Monastery of St. Mark in Jerusalem. At first, the discovery went largely unnoticed. But in the next year, Gerald Lancaster Harding, Chief Inspector of Antiquities in the British Mandate of Palestine, and Father Roland Deveau, head of the École Biblique, began excavating the caves. This led to the discovery of hundreds of documents. Some were nearly complete scrolls. Many others were just fragments of documents, and some fragments were so small that it was impossible to identify them with any specific document. For almost 1900 years, the scrolls at Qumran had remained undisturbed. But why were they there in the first place? Well, although no one knows for sure, the available evidence seems to suggest that during the war against the Jewish people in Judea and Galilee between AD 66 and 73, either the Romans destroyed the community that kept the scrolls, or the community abandoned their location. But at some point before disappearing, they put the scrolls into clay jars and stored them in caves, leaving them to be found almost 2,000 years later.
What we know what happened to the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls is a little bit of a mystery. We know the site was destroyed by the Romans, but what happened to the people is unknown. There's a good chance that some of them made their way down to Masada, because some of the texts found in the excavations in Masada are only known also at the excavations at Qumran. So there could have been a group that fled Qumran when the Romans were coming, joined up with the rebels down at Masada, and they all ultimately met their demise there.
So how did these artifacts survive so long in such a relatively stable level of preservation? Well, many of the things that destroy parchment, papyrus, and leather, mold, rats, direct water damage, depend on an abundance of moisture. Since the scrolls were stored in a very dry area and were shielded even further by being in jars and caves, many of the factors that could degrade the scrolls simply weren't present. Since the 1950s, biblical scholars and archaeologists have painstakingly pieced together thousands of fragments, written mostly on parchment in Hebrew, comprising over 800 documents. Their work of reconstruction, analysis, and translation has identified 3 main groups of texts: biblical, sectarian, and extra-biblical religious writings from the Second Temple period. Biblical texts comprise approximately 40% of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These texts are by far the earliest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible known to exist. Carbon and paleographic dating suggest that the scrolls were created from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. Prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest known Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible were the Masoretic texts produced by the Masoretes in the 10th or 11th century AD. Every book of the Hebrew Bible is represented except Esther. The great Isaiah scroll, now housed at the Shrine of the Book in the Israeli Antiquities Museum, is the largest and most well-preserved scroll. It contains all 66 chapters of Isaiah. Sectarian texts account for about 30% of the findings. These are texts particular to the community at Qumran. Texts like The Rule of the Community, found in Cave 1, are extremely valuable to archaeologists and scholars. They detail the governance, worship, and biblical interpretation practices of the community that left the Dead Sea Scrolls. Extra-biblical religious writings make up the remaining 30% of the documents found. These include commentaries on biblical books, retellings of biblical stories, and additional psalms and prayers which were probably used by the community in their corporate worship. A small group of these manuscripts may not have been produced at Qumran, but rather visitors to the community or others who came from outside to join the sect may have brought them. For example, the Psalms of the Sabbath Sacrifice are a series of 13 songs, each for a separate Sabbath celebration. Most scholars believe these particular psalms were not limited to use in the Qumran community. There have been copies found elsewhere, and the language is somewhat different than the language in the sectarian texts. The Dead Sea Scrolls has been one of the greatest discoveries of modern times. Now, let's consider what they tell us about the Qumran community that stored these manuscripts.
Of course, we can't know everything in absolute detail about the community at Qumran, but still we can learn much from what others wrote about them, and especially from the writings that they themselves left behind. Some scholars think that they may have been Sadducees, or perhaps members of some unknown religious sect. But most scholars believe that the community at Qumran was related to a sect within Judaism known as the Essenes. There were groups of Essenes throughout Judea and Galilee, and they had a reputation for being strict observers of the Mosaic Law. Most groups of Essenes lived in closely connected, insular communities within cities or villages, often holding their material goods in common.
First-century Jewish historian Josephus described the Essenes in Book 2, Chapter 8 of the Jewish War. He wrote, "Three forms of philosophy are pursued among the Judeans. The members of one are Pharisees, of another Sadducees, and the third school, who certainly are reputed to cultivate seriousness, are called Essenes. Although Judeans by ancestry, they are even more mutually affectionate than the others. No one city is theirs, but they settle amply in each. And for those school members who arrive from elsewhere, all that the community has is laid out for them in the same way as if they were their own things. And they go in and stay with those they have never even seen before, as if they were the most intimate friends."
The term Essenes was actually originally a pejorative designation of a number of Jewish sects and groups of people as early as the 2nd century before Christ and at least as late as the 2nd Christian century. Now, most scholars rightly believe that the term was applied to the Qumran community at the Dead Sea. The isolated Jewish communities at Qumran considered themselves to be the true remnant of Israel, who were faithful to God's covenant. They preserved many of the scriptures of the Tanakh, or what Christians call the Old Testament, and they also followed the authoritative priestly leaders that they had selected who rejected the priesthood in Jerusalem.
Those at Qumran appear to have been of a particularly strict sect of Essenes. Instead of living in a city or a village, like the ones described by Josephus, the Qumran community withdrew into the desert near the Dead Sea. Some leading scholars think an intense struggle over the legitimacy of the temple priesthood may have prompted this move. From their writings, we can conclude that they were an offshoot of Judaism who emphasized faithfulness to the Jewish law, but believed the priesthood in Jerusalem had become corrupt. So instead of participating in the sacrificial system at the temple, they withdrew and waited for God to reestablish righteousness in Israel and rectify the temple service and priesthood. We can infer from their documents, especially the Damascus document, that the community initially coalesced around a leader referred to as the teacher of righteousness. This teacher established what the community believed regarding the proper method of interpreting the scriptures, and particularly regarding the right way of living and worshiping together according to the law of Moses.
One priestly figure, whom they called the teacher of righteousness, insisted on strictly regulated ritual purity in preparation for a final cataclysmic battle between the forces of darkness and the forces of light, and that this battle would bring about the spread of the kingdom of God throughout the entire earth.
Some of the extra-biblical texts, like the commentary on Habakkuk, extol the teacher as one to whom God made known all the mysteries of the words of his servants, the prophets. But not every governing document found at Qumran mentions the teacher of righteousness. For instance, the rule of the community says nothing about this leader. Some scholars believe that the rule of the community and the Damascus document must have been produced by different groups, but their similarities outweigh their differences. Both documents list rules for initiation, ritual washings, meals, and Sabbath worship that were distinctive of the Qumran community. Both documents also express intense hopes for an apocalyptic reckoning when God will intervene in history to vindicate his people and punish the wicked. And both voice expectations about a Messiah or Messiahs who will restore the true people of God. The community at Qumran had a number of specific beliefs, but we'll look at one in particular, their hopes for the Messiah. In The Rule of the Community, column 9, line 11, the author wrote, "There shall come the Messiahs of Aaron and Israel." We find similar language in the Damascus document. Although scholars debate the precise meaning of the phrase Messiahs of Aaron and Israel, it seems that the community at Qumran expected both a priestly Messiah and a royal Messiah. Whether this priestly royal Messiah was one or two people, the community hoped that he or they would vindicate the true priesthood, purify the people, and deliver them from false leaders who had corrupted wider Jewish society. This same concern is also present in several other biblical, sectarian, and extra-biblical texts found at Qumran.
There was definitely messianic expectation at Qumran. In one of the key documents, the Manual of Discipline that shaped how the community lived, they make reference, in fact, to two messiahs, one priestly and one Davidic, with the priestly being the more prominent of the two. So in one of their key documents, they definitely had the idea of Messiah. The other document that shapes that as a lot is a later discovery known as 4Q 521, a document that explicitly mentions a Messiah who will raise the dead when Messiah comes. And this one adds a whole nother layer to the messianic expectation of the Qumran community. What we can't be sure of is how widespread this belief was within the community, but we do have it documented in the key document that shaped the community, plus this one description of Messiah's coming, that they had a definite expectation of a Messiah who would raise the dead.
Some of the extra-biblical documents found at Qumran associate their messianic expectations with known biblical figures. For example, the Melchizedek document refers to Melchizedek, the king of Salem, an enigmatic figure mentioned in Genesis 14. In a fragment from Cave 11, we read these words, "Melchizedek will judge the holy ones of God. This is the day of salvation, concerning which God spoke through the prophet Isaiah. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who says to Zion, your Elohim reigns. Zion is those who uphold the covenant, who turn from walking in the ways of the people. And your Elohim is Melchizedek, who will save them." Elohim is one of God's names, but it also can be used to refer to divine or supernatural beings in general. So this fragment describes Melchizedek as a quasi-divine or angelic figure who will bring the day of salvation promised in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 7.
The full text of the Melchizedek document quotes many parts of Scripture. And this interweaving of biblical texts and the focus on the final day of salvation were important features of biblical interpretation at Qumran. Interestingly, these same features existed in contemporaneous Christian communities. But Christian communities believe that all the messianic hints and hopes that are described in the Hebrew Bible were fulfilled in Jesus of Nazareth. For example, a Qumran document that modern scholars call a messianic apocalypse affirms Isaiah's prophecy that the Lord will send his Messiah to liberate the captives, restore sight to the blind, revive the dead, and bring good news to the poor. And in Luke chapter 4, Jesus claimed to be the fulfillment of this prophecy.
The Dead Sea Scrolls have taught us a lot about the messianic hopes at Qumran. Now, let's consider the impact these documents have had on the world from their discovery until today. Scholars often use the biblical texts found at Qumran to understand how the text of the Hebrew Bible has been preserved throughout history. These texts are the earliest known manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible by roughly 1,000 years. By comparing them with the Masoretic text, the dominant tradition of the Hebrew text from the 10th or 11th century, we get a good idea of how stable the text of the Hebrew Bible was in the intervening period. Some pastors and apologists mistakenly state that the text of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text are identical or nearly identical. But when we look more closely at the documents, we see that this is not true. Many Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts are remarkably similar to the Masoretic text and bear witness to its earlier form, but others have variants that align more with the Samaritan tradition or with the Septuagint, the Old Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And some manuscripts, while being largely similar to the Masoretic text, have variants that don't seem to align with any known tradition. Of course, some people have exaggerated the differences as well. While it's true that some variants change the meaning or flow of passages, many of the differences tend to be incredibly minor, such as spelling or word choice. So on the whole, the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that the Masoretic text faithfully represents a text that existed several centuries before Christ.
In 1947, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first found, the big question on everybody's mind was, what do these tell us about the Bible? What do they tell us about the reliability of the canon? And the Qumran texts give us a lot of confidence in the Bibles we hold today, but they do show some fluidity. In general, the biblical texts of Qumran are very similar to the later what we call Masoretic texts, but we had some texts of Qumran in Hebrew that looked more similar to the Septuagint. We had other texts that looked more similar to what became the Masoretic text. So it does show some dynamic realities between the texts, but in general, the Dead Sea Scrolls give us great confidence in the Bibles we hold today.
The Dead Sea Scrolls also illuminate the historical context of the New Testament. Through the sectarian texts and the non-biblical religious writings found at Qumran, scholars have gained a better understanding of the theological debates that formed the backdrop for the New Testament. The Qumran community was frustrated at Israel's unfaithfulness. They strongly denounced the temple priests and the way the sacrifices were conducted. They viewed the present age as an age in which sin and evil triumphed on every side. They longed for the age to come, when God would destroy the forces of darkness in a climactic victory, establishing his people in his land. They looked forward to a Messiah, or possibly two, who would lead God's people in the end times, and they awaited the reward of those who were faithful and righteous. Although the Qumran community was a somewhat fringe movement in the Judean wilderness, its concerns paralleled many of those that occupied the earliest Christians. Israel's need for redemption, the corruption of the priests and temple services, the prevalence of evil in this age, hope for the kingdom of God and the age to come, Jesus the Messiah, and the reward of the faithful and righteous. In these and many other ways, the scrolls and fragments found at Qumran help us understand the New Testament's historical context.
Prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we didn't have much direct information about different ideas and teachings in Judaism that were directly from that time. So they give us a lot of background information on what were the topics of conversation, what were some of the controversies, what were people thinking about different ideas, how were they interpreting the Hebrew Bible. So, for example, in the Gospels, of course, there's a lot of discussion with Jesus and the Pharisees about Sabbath laws. What can you do and not do on the Sabbath? And sure enough, in the Qumran documents, we see a lot of discussion about Sabbath laws. What can you do? What can you not do? How do you fulfill them? What's appropriate? What's not? So it helped us to see that these are not just idiosyncratic questions, but they come from a context, and they're answered within that context. Another example is of course, the messianic expectations, but also, maybe more specifically, which passages from the Hebrew Bible tended to be more prominent in those discussions. So you actually see some similarity between the passages used in the Gospels and the passages used at Qumran. For example, Isaiah 61, right? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, He has anointed me, right? Same passage quoted in a messianic context in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it gives us sometimes very specific links to help us see how people were thinking about these topics in the Gospels.
Based on similarities between the Qumran community and the early church, it might be tempting to think that there was a relationship between the two groups. But the Qumran community was not a Christian community. The Dead Sea Scrolls make no reference to Christianity, and none of the scrolls contain any portions of the New Testament. Similarly, the scrolls never mention Jesus or John the Baptist or any other New Testament figure. As a result, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has not fundamentally altered most scholars' understanding of the New Testament or the early Christian movement. Still, these documents have added valuable context to the New Testament and have helped explain the appeal of its messianic message.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are a fascinating discovery. They provide ancient proof of the reliability and stability of the text of all portions of the Hebrew Bible across millennia. They confirm the social and religious context that's described in the New Testament, and they provide substantial insight into the Second Temple period. Even today, scholars and archaeologists continue to study and learn from them. And for many people of faith, they provide strong evidence of the historicity of the Bible, making them the most encouraging archaeological find of the past century.
Dr. Jeff Kloha, that was speaking toward the end there, he is LCMS Lutheran, was a professor at our seminary, and really great guy. I want you to think for just a second. If you've ever seen Planet of the Apes or any of those movies that have an apocalypse and they are 1,000 years in the future and their society is based on writings or books that they discovered in destroyed libraries. But they only have this much. Planet of the Apes, they only have part of things. Now, I want you to think today, if an apocalypse happened, and 1,000 years from now or 500 years from now, somebody came upon this island and they had an intact Bible, but they also had books that were written, fiction and nonfiction, podcasts, videos, sermons, written by 150 or 1,000 different pastors or individuals. How would they determine which ones bore witness to this book and which ones didn't? Because when they are working through this, if you listen to all sorts of different Christian music, everything from classical like Beethoven, Bach, other individuals that make moving, stirring symphonies, to the newest contemporary Christian worship, to also secular artists who put out religious music occasionally, or music that appears to have some sort of a religious or faith theme. If you go up and look at all the books on my library, because I have an entire shelf of fictional books that are based in theology or faith. If you were not raised in the Christian church, but simply were given a Bible, and then found yourself listening, looking, reading, experiencing all these videos, podcasts, all these things, how would you use them to figure out what this book was saying? That's what the Museum of the Bible is doing. It's what we're going to be doing over the next 4 weeks. We're going to be finding out that when Jesus told a parable, it was so open-ended that people could walk away from the parable and say, this is what Jesus said. And somebody else over here could say, no, 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 this is what Jesus said. And the two were completely opposite. Because Jesus didn't say, this is the only meaning that I will accept. We have individuals who have written commentaries where they say, I read this version, this is what I think it means. And what we have to do is, by analyzing the culture, analyzing where the certain things came from, know a little bit about the community from which they came from, the various teachings, beliefs, and things that influence them, that will also tell us a little bit about what they said and how they wrote it and why they wrote certain things. This is why when you get a Bible, and most Bibles just have the straight scriptures. If you get a commentary Bible, you have to make sure that the group you are purchasing the commentary Bible from is at least close to your theological view. Because there are commentary Bibles out there that are so far afield that they would not be accepted by the historical traditional church. There are others that are so narrow that, like they were saying about the Essenes, everything has to fit within a tiny little box. If I'm wanting to preserve something, I would rather have the people who say this is the tiny box. But in a church, when I have somebody who is just a brand new Christian, and they're saying, Pastor, what version of the Bible should I read? I have to say, well, let's talk about it. What's your educational level? What is it? Are you a person who understands by listening or by doing? Are you a person, by the way, who prefers stories? Or do you prefer historical, critical writings? Let's get you started. Once you get up a little bit, then we'll take a look, because one single Bible is not enough. I have dozens and dozens of them. And occasionally I go through, not because I believe that they say different things, but because occasionally they say it in a way that makes a little more sense to me, or say it in a way that it might make more sense to you. And I'm always looking for a way, because the purpose of this is not to just say you have a book that runs your life. This is to shape you, because this is where God says, my word never returns to me empty, always accomplishes the task for which I sent it. And even though this word, by the way, is nothing but ink and paper, the Spirit of God is able to take this and shape you, because then you become his word out to the nations. And so for the next 4 weeks, we're going to be analyzing specifically 2 Timothy 3:16 and what it says about all scripture is God-breathed. It's useful for correcting, training, rebuking. Its purpose is to take us and draw us closer to God. And once we are near God, he impacts us in ways, and as he sends us back into the world, we never leave him changed. We're always impacted. And when we go out into the world, we discover that we are able to say and do things that by God's grace and mercy allows us to be exactly who he needs us to be in our time and in our space. We'll go in peace. We'll see you next week. It will be a challenging 4 weeks, but I really believe that it's going to be worth it.